Adirondack Mountains, New York, November 1891. While most men built their hearths against exterior walls, following generations of accepted practice, one weathered hunter was about to challenge everything the settlement knew about keeping warm. His name was Henrik Voss, a Norwegian immigrant who'd spent 43 winters in these mountains, and what he proposed seemed to violate every principle of practical cabin construction. He's building his fireplace in the middle of the room, William Bradley told the other men at Morrison's General Store, shaking his head in disbelief. Not against a wall, right in the center like some kind of primitive cooking pit. The men laughed. Everyone knew fireplaces belonged against walls, preferably exterior ones where the chimney could rise straight up without complicating the roof structure. That's how it had always been done. That's how every cabin in the region was built. But Henrik Voss wasn't listening to them. And before that winter was over, every single one of those laughing men would be standing in his cabin, measuring temperatures, counting logs, and trying to understand what this quiet hunter had figured out about heat distribution that generations of builders had somehow missed. If you're watching from somewhere cold right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if you want to learn the forgotten engineering that kept our ancestors warmer with half the wood, hit that subscribe button. We're about to reveal heating secrets that modern builders are only now rediscovering, and you'll want to see every minute of what comes next. The mockery began the moment Henrik laid the foundation stones. Traditional Adirondack cabins followed a simple pattern: fireplace against the north or east wall, chimney rising through the exterior, hearth opening facing into the main living space. The design had been replicated hundreds of times across the mountain settlements. It was proven. It was practical. It was what experienced builders did. Henrik Voss was doing something different, fundamentally different. He positioned his firebox exactly 12 feet from the cabin's front wall and 11 feet from the rear, dead center of the 23 by 24 foot structure. The foundation wasn't a simple rectangle. He'd created a circular base, 4 feet in diameter, using river stones he'd selected with obsessive care. Each stone weighed between 40 and 70 pounds. He rejected softer sandstone entirely, choosing only dense granite and basalt. "You're wasting good floor space," James Morrison told him, watching Henrik cement another layer of foundation stone. "And how exactly do you plan to run that chimney? Straight up through the middle of your roof?" Henrik's answer was measured in Swedish accented English. "Heat moves in all directions. Wall fireplace sends half the warmth outside. Center fireplace has nowhere to go but into the room." Morrison snorted. "That's not how chimneys work, friend. You need draft. You need draw. You're going to fill this place with smoke." But Henrik continued working. The firebox he constructed was smaller than conventional designs, just 18 inches deep and 22 inches wide. What made it unusual was the throat. Instead of the standard straight vertical rise, he angled it at precisely 37 degrees for the first 14 inches, then transitioned to vertical. Around this firebox, he built something that looked more like a fortification than a hearth. 4 feet of stone in every direction. Not just any stone. He'd hauled 1,200 pounds of dense metamorphic rock from a quarry site 6 miles away. The exterior of this central mass featured carefully fitted stones, while the interior layers contained smaller rocks mortared with a clay mixture he'd formulated himself, adding sand and lime in proportions he'd learned from his grandfather in Trondheim. "It's a monument to stubborn foolishness," declared Bradley, who'd built 17 cabins in the region. That much mass in the center of the floor, the whole structure could settle unevenly. And he's still got to figure out how to roof around that chimney penetration without creating a permanent leak. The criticism intensified when Henrik began constructing the chimney itself. Instead of the typical single-wall stone construction, he built a double-wall system with a 3-inch air gap between inner and outer layers. The inner wall was lined with firebrick, an expensive choice that seemed absurd for a simple hunting cabin. "He's building a chimney that costs more than most men's entire cabin," Morrison observed. "And for what? So he can have a fire in the middle of his floor like some kind of teepee?" Henrik's response was always the same quiet patience. "We will see when winter comes." What Henrik Voss understood, and what his critics dismissed, was the fundamental physics of radiant heat distribution. A traditional wall-mounted fireplace releases approximately 73% of its heat in a forward-facing hemisphere. The remaining 27% conducts through the stone backing and radiates into the exterior wall cavity, where much of it escapes to the outside air. The firebox opening faces one direction, creating an uneven heat distribution that leaves corners cold and forces constant adjustment of seating positions throughout the evening. Henrik's central fireplace eliminated this directionality entirely. Heat radiated 360 degrees from the stone mass. Every square foot of cabin floor received thermal energy at roughly equal intensity, modified only by distance from the source. There were no cold corners. There were no good seats close to warmth and bad seats in the shadows. But the real innovation wasn't just positioning. It was thermal mass and time-release storage. The 1,200 pounds of dense stone Henrik had assembled didn't just support the firebox. It functioned as a massive thermal battery. Metamorphic rocks like gneiss and schist have specific heat capacities around 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. His stone mass could absorb and store approximately 240 BTUs for every degree of temperature rise. During active burning, the stone would heat to temperatures between 400 degrees Fahrenheit and 600 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on fire intensity. After the fire died down, or was deliberately extinguished before bed, that stored heat would radiate gradually back into the cabin for 6 to 8 hours. The cooling curve was gentle and sustained, nothing like the rapid temperature crash that occurred when wall fireplaces went cold. Henrik had also calculated something else: chimney efficiency through draft optimization. His angled throat section created a Venturi effect that accelerated combustion gases while maintaining lower overall air velocity through the firebox. This meant more complete combustion, less smoke, less creosote, more heat extracted from each log before the gases exited the structure. The double-walled chimney with its air gap served two purposes. First, it reduced heat loss through the chimney walls themselves. Second, the air gap created a natural convection current that pre-warmed incoming combustion air, improving draft consistency even in extreme cold when dense exterior air could sometimes create reverse flow in poorly designed chimneys. Pure nonsense, declared Edmund Hartley, a mason who'd studied in Boston before moving to the mountains. The man's confusing mass with efficiency. Yes, stone holds heat, but it also takes forever to warm up. He'll burn 3 times the wood just getting that monument hot enough to matter. Hartley's objection seemed reasonable. Initial heating of thermal mass does require significant energy input. A conventional wall fireplace reaches operating temperature within 20 minutes. Henrik's massive central structure would need 2 to 3 hours of sustained burning before the stone fully heated. But Hartley was thinking in terms of individual fires and immediate comfort. Henrik was thinking in terms of 24-hour thermal cycles and total energy efficiency over weeks and months of continuous habitation. The question wasn't whether the central mass took longer to heat initially. The question was whether it provided superior total warmth per log burned across an entire winter season. And that question could only be answered through direct comparison under real conditions. Those conditions were about to arrive. By late November 1891, Henrik's cabin was nearing completion, and the mockery had evolved into something darker. Genuine concern that the old hunter wouldn't survive his first winter in this experimental structure. "He's 63 years old," Sarah Morrison whispered to her husband. "If that contraption fails, if he can't keep warm, he could freeze to death before anyone finds him." The chimney had proven to be the most challenging element. Henrik had to cut a circular roof penetration 32 inches in diameter, far larger than typical chimney openings. The double-wall construction required precise spacing maintained through the entire vertical run. At the roofline, he'd fabricated a copper flashing system that telescoped to allow for seasonal wood expansion while preventing water infiltration. That flashing alone cost more than most men spend on an entire chimney, Bradley observed, watching Henrik solder the final seams. And he still hasn't tested it in real rain. One good storm, and he'll have water running down inside those stone walls. The interior layout of the cabin reflected the central fireplace's unconventional placement. Henrik had positioned his bed along the south wall, his food storage and preparation area on the north side, and a small writing desk by the east-facing window. The central hearth sat equidistant from all these zones, no area more than 12 feet from the radiating stone mass. He'd also installed something the neighbors found peculiar: a series of wooden dowels projecting from the stone mass at different heights, positioned at 45-degree angles. These weren't decorative. They were drying racks for wet clothing, positioned to capture rising warm air without being close enough to the firebox to present a fire hazard. The man thinks of everything except whether the basic idea makes sense, Hartley muttered, examining the dowel placement. Complicated solutions to problems he's creating himself. Henrik completed the cabin on December 3rd, 1891. He moved his belongings in immediately. Bedding, cooking implements, his hunting rifles, 50 pounds of cornmeal, 30 pounds of salt pork, dried beans, and enough coffee to last until spring. He also stacked 2 full cords of mixed hardwood, primarily oak and maple, with some birch for quick-starting fires. His neighbors, meanwhile, had their own with supplies ready. Bradley had cut and stacked 4 cords for his slightly larger cabin. Morrison had prepared 3.5 cords. Both men expected to need additional cutting before winter ended, but they'd start with what they considered adequate reserves. On December 5th, Henrik lit his first fire in the central hearth. He started with birch bark and small oak splits, building gradually to larger pieces as the firebox established proper draft. The first hour produced more smoke than expected, the cold chimney creating sluggish flow until the stone warmed sufficiently to establish natural convection. But by the second hour, the system found its rhythm. The angled throat created smooth laminar flow, visible in the steady, transparent shimmer of rising heat above the firebox opening. The double-walled chimney began to warm, and Henrik could feel the draft strengthen as convection accelerated. By evening, the stone mass had absorbed hours of heat. Henrik added 3 oak logs, let them burn down to coals, then let the fire die completely before going to bed at 9 o'clock. If you're starting to see the genius in this design, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the crazy ideas are the only ones that actually work. Drop a comment telling us, would you trust the design everyone else mocked? December 17th, 1891. Temperature at dawn, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. For 12 days, Henrik had been refining his burning routine. Morning fire from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. Evening fire from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. Total burning time, 8 hours per day. The pattern established a thermal rhythm: heat storage during burns, gradual radiation during the 16 hours between fires. Inside his cabin at 7 a.m., with the morning fire burning for 1 hour, the temperature measured 61 degrees Fahrenheit. By 10 a.m., when he let the fire die to coals, it had reached 68 degrees Fahrenheit. By 5 p.m., 7 hours after the last flame, the cabin interior still registered 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, in Bradley's cabin 300 yards away, a wall-mounted fireplace burned continuously from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 16 hours daily. The temperature near the hearth reached 72 degrees Fahrenheit during peak burns, but dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by morning in the corners farthest from the fire. Morrison's cabin showed similar patterns: high heat near the fireplace, cold zones in distant corners, and a brutal temperature crash whenever the fire died down. But these were mild conditions. The real test arrived on Christmas Eve. A massive Arctic front swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures to levels the region hadn't experienced in 17 years. By midnight on December 24th, the thermometer outside Henrik's cabin read minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 a.m. on Christmas morning, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Bradley woke at 4 a.m., shivering despite 3 wool blankets. His fire had died to ash around midnight. The interior temperature had plunged to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that frost had formed on the interior walls near the corners. He scrambled to restart the fire, fingers numb, breath visible in the darkness. Morrison faced identical conditions. His children huddled together under every available blanket while he worked frantically to revive flames from barely warm coals. The cabin wouldn't reach comfortable temperature until nearly 7 a.m., and even then, the corners would remain bitterly cold. Henrik Voss woke at his usual time, 6 a.m. The interior temperature of his cabin, measured at 3 different locations, averaged 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive stone hearth, which had absorbed heat from his evening fire 7 hours earlier, was still radiating warmth. Frost had formed on his windows, but nowhere on the interior walls. The radiant heat from the central mass prevented condensation from freezing anywhere inside the living space. He built his morning fire slowly, methodically, just as he'd done every day for 3 weeks. By 7 a.m., the cabin temperature had risen to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. By 9 a.m., 66 degrees Fahrenheit. He used exactly 4 oak logs and 2 birch splits, the same amount he burned every morning. At 10 a.m., James Morrison made the cold walk to Henrik's cabin, ostensibly to check on the old hunter's welfare. What he found left him speechless. Henrik sat at his writing desk in his shirt sleeves, drinking coffee, recording observations in a leather journal. The cabin felt warm, genuinely, evenly warm, despite the fact that outside the temperature still hovered at -9 degrees Fahrenheit. "How much wood did you burn last night?" Morrison asked, looking at the hearth where only gray ash remained from the previous evening's fire. 3 logs, Henrik replied. "Same as always. Evening fire, for hours, let it die before bed." Morrison walked slowly around the central stone mass, holding his hand out at different distances. The warmth was uniform, radiating in all directions. He moved to the corners of the cabin, the places that, in his own home, were currently freezing despite a fire that had been burning continuously since 4 a.m. The temperature in Henrik's north corner, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The south corner, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The east corner, near the window, 51 degrees Fahrenheit. "This isn't possible," Morrison said quietly. "My cabin's been burning since 4 this morning, and the back corner's still 40 degrees. Henrik smiled, that patient smile his neighbors had seen throughout the construction process. "Wall fireplace sends half the heat outside. Center fireplace has nowhere to go but into the room." The same words he'd spoken 3 months earlier. The words everyone had dismissed as the confused logic of an old man who didn't understand modern building practices. But the thermometer didn't care about conventional wisdom. The thermometer only recorded facts, and the facts were undeniable. By December 27th, 1891, word had spread through the settlement. Men who'd spent weeks mocking Henrik Voss were now making excuses to visit his cabin, measuring temperatures, examining his wood consumption, and trying to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they thought they knew about heating. The numbers told a story that was impossible to dismiss. Henrik's daily wood consumption, 7 to 9 logs, depending on length and diameter. Average weight per log, 11 pounds. Total daily consumption, approximately 88 pounds of hardwood. His 2-cord initial supply, roughly 5,200 pounds of wood, would last approximately 59 days of continuous habitation at this rate. Bradley's consumption during the same period, 16 to 19 logs daily, averaging 13 pounds each. Total daily consumption, approximately 228 pounds. His 4-cord supply, 10,400 pounds, would last 45 to 48 days at this rate, despite being twice Henrik's initial reserve. Morrison's numbers fell between the two, but the pattern was identical, substantially higher consumption for inferior heating performance. But the real revelation came from detailed temperature mapping that Edmund Hartley conducted on December 29th. The mason arrived with a thermometer and notebook, determined to either validate or disprove what everyone was claiming about Henrik's cabin. He took measurements at 17 different locations inside Henrik's cabin and compared them to identical positions in Bradley's cabin and Morrison's cabin. The fires in all 3 cabins had been burning for 2 hours when measurements began. All 3 used similar wood, oak and maple hardwoods. Henrik's cabin showed temperature variation of only 6 degrees Fahrenheit between the warmest point, adjacent to the stone mass at 67 degrees Fahrenheit, and the coldest corner, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The average interior temperature across all measurement points, 64.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Bradley's cabin showed a 31 degrees Fahrenheit variation. Warmest point near the hearth, 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Coldest corner, northeast, farthest from fireplace, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Average temperature, 56.8 degrees Fahrenheit, despite consuming nearly 3 times the wood. Morrison's cabin was similar, 29 degrees Fahrenheit variation. Average temperature, 58.1 degrees Fahrenheit. But Hartley wanted more than single-day snapshots. He convinced all 3 men to let him conduct overnight measurements. On the night of December 30th, he recorded temperatures at 3-hour intervals in each cabin from 9 p.m., when fires were allowed to die, until 6 a.m., when morning fires were started. Henrik's cabin at 9 p.m., fire just extinguished, average 66 degrees Fahrenheit. At midnight, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3 a.m., 54 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6 a.m., 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Total overnight temperature drop, 15 degrees Fahrenheit over 9 hours. Bradley's cabin at 9 p.m. Average 61 degrees Fahrenheit near hearth, 48 degrees Fahrenheit in corners. At midnight, 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 39 degrees Fahrenheit respectively. At 3 a.m., 43 degrees Fahrenheit and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. At 6 a.m., 37 degrees Fahrenheit and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The far corners had actually dropped below freezing. Morrison's cabin showed nearly identical overnight collapse, from comfortable evening warmth to near freezing by morning in the zones farthest from the dead fireplace. Hartley sat in Henrik's cabin on the morning of December 31st, reviewing his measurements by lantern light. The old hunter was preparing coffee, moving comfortably in the 51 degrees Fahrenheit interior despite the fact that no fire had burned for 9 hours and the exterior temperature was 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal mass, Hartley said slowly, understanding finally clicking into place. It's not just holding heat, it's releasing it at exactly the rate needed to maintain livable temperature through the night. Henrik nodded. In Trondheim, my grandfather built the same way. He called it banking the warmth. Stone remembers the fire even after flames die. Hartley did quick calculations in his notebook. The 1,200 pounds of stone, cooling from approximately 400 degrees Fahrenheit to 200 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, would release roughly 48,000 BTUs, enough energy to maintain a 20 degrees Fahrenheit temperature differential between interior and exterior for a well-insulated 500 square foot space over 8 to 9 hours. The physics was elegant and undeniable. Henrik hadn't just built a fireplace. He built a thermal battery that charged during active burns and discharged gradually through the night, maintaining comfort with a fraction of the fuel that conventional designs required. I was wrong, Hartley said quietly. We were all wrong. Henrik poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to the mason. In the mountains, being right keeps you alive. Being wrong just keeps you cold. Outside, the wind howled through pine trees bent under ice. Inside, 2 men sat in shirt sleeves, drinking coffee in a cabin heated by a fire that had died 9 hours earlier. The stone in the center of the room radiated its patient, persistent warmth, proving that sometimes the oldest ideas are the ones we need most. January 1892 brought 3 more severe cold snaps, with temperatures dropping below 0 Fahrenheit on 8 separate nights. Each event reinforced what had become obvious to everyone in the settlement. Henrik Voss had rediscovered something fundamental that modern building practices had somehow forgotten. By February, William Bradley had begun dismantling his wall-mounted fireplace. Tearing out 3 years of work, he told Henrik, but I can't spend another winter burning twice the wood for half the warmth. He wasn't alone. James Morrison hired Henrik as a consultant, paying him in salt pork and coffee to advise on a central hearth renovation. Edmund Hartley began designing central fireplaces for new construction projects, incorporating Henrik's lessons about thermal mass, radiant distribution, and the critical importance of dense stone selection. Within 18 months, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated central hearth designs. Not exact copies of Henrik's original. Each builder adapted the principle to their specific structure and needs, but all sharing the core insight. Heat radiating from central mass distributes more evenly and stores more efficiently than heat projected from a wall-mounted source. The innovation spread beyond the Adirondacks. Hartley published technical drawings in a regional builder's journal, explaining the thermodynamics without mentioning the initial mockery his colleagues had directed at Henrik. The designs reached Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of rural Quebec, where French-Canadian homesteaders recognized similarities to traditional pole-de-masse concepts their grandparents had used. By 1895, central heating stoves, not fireplaces exactly, but metal stoves positioned centrally rather than against walls, had become common in northern territories. The principle had evolved, but the core insight remained. Centralized heat sources with substantial thermal mass outperform wall-mounted designs in almost every measurable way. Henrik Voss lived in his cabin until 1903, when at age 74 he finally moved to his daughter's home in Albany. The cabin stood empty for 2 years before a young family from Massachusetts purchased it, drawn by the unusual central hearth they'd heard about from relatives in the region. They lived there for 38 years. 3 generations warmed themselves by that stone mass. The original hearth, built in 1891, remained functional until 1947 when the cabin was finally demolished to make way for a modern road. But photographs survive. Measurements survive. And the lesson survives, though it's been forgotten and rediscovered multiple times across different cultures and continents. The lesson is simple. Efficiency isn't always about new technology or modern materials. Sometimes it's about understanding fundamental physics, how heat moves, how mass stores energy, how geometry affects distribution, and having the courage to build differently even when everyone tells you you're wrong. Henrik Voss didn't invent the central hearth. Variations existed in Japanese farmhouses, Irori, Mongolian jars, and traditional Korean homes, Ondal, for centuries. What he did was apply proven principles in a context where they'd been abandoned in favor of supposedly superior wall-mounted designs. He proved that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. On cold winter nights in modern homes, with central heating systems burning natural gas or electricity to maintain comfort, we're still learning the same lesson Henrik tried to teach in 1891. The best place for a heat source isn't always where convention says it should be. Sometimes the best place is exactly where the old hunters, the immigrants, the grandmothers and grandfathers put it. Right in the center of everything, radiating warmth in all directions, storing energy for the long cold hours between fires. They mocked him for building a monument to stubborn foolishness. But what he actually built was a monument to patient wisdom. The kind of wisdom that survives winter after winter, generation after generation, waiting for someone humble enough to recognize that being warm matters more than being right, and that sometimes the crazy old hunter knows something the experts have forgotten. If this story changed how you think about heating, design, or listening to unconventional wisdom, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got dozens more stories about frontier innovations that modern science is only now validating. Drop a comment telling us, what old-fashioned technique do you think we should never have abandoned? Your answer might become our next video. This presentation is educational and historical in nature. While the thermodynamic principles described are scientifically sound, any modern heating system should comply with current building codes and safety standards. Consult licensed professionals before undertaking any home heating modifications.